I'd like to welcome everyone to our second class on Mesopotamian religion. Like I said, the first one was last month. We covered some history. So we did Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian history. And we also then covered mythology, the creation, flood, Gilgamesh, Ishtar's descent into the netherworld, and several other related and interesting myths. So, when I did my introduction to religion, we talked about how you can organize religion and think about religion by the problem, the solution, and how the solution is implemented. And I did that with, Christianity. The problem is sin, the solution is Christ's atonement, and how is it implemented? Baptism, repentance, etc. You can do it with Islam. What's the problem? The problem is pride. The solution is submission to Allah, and how is that done? There's the 5 pillars in the Quran, etc. But I never really applied that to Mesopotamian religion. And the reason I didn't is because it's not quite as trivial, and it's not quite as straightforward with regard to what the answers to those questions are for the Mesopotamians. They didn't see a worldwide problem of sin. They didn't believe in sin in the same way. They weren't. The central problem wasn't pride, and so the solution isn't necessarily submission. They had a whole host of problems, etc., that they saw. And so it's very difficult, at least for me, to summarize appropriately Mesopotamian religion in the same way I was able to do for others. Buddhism, what's the problem? Suffering, what's the solution? Enlightenment, how is that obtained? The Noble Eightfold Path. But I think you can come close. So I think if I were to try to make a stab at how to apply that same summary to Mesopotamian religion, it might go something like this. The problem is that life is short and hard. They looked at the problem of pain directly, and they just said, life is hard, and that's the problem. But the solution is to appease the gods if you can. And they recognized they didn't have the same problem of Christianity and Judaism where you try to imagine a perfect good God. The gods were just personifications of the forces of nature. And just as the forces of nature can be capricious or whimsical, so the gods can be. Sometimes they'll punish you for no reason. Sometimes, bad things happen and because they're just in a bad mood. And so it's almost like a child trying to deal with an abusive alcoholic parent. And you just try to appease them as best you can. And that seems to be the Mesopotamian approach, is you're going to appease the gods as best you can because you recognize that the gods sometimes treat people badly. And so you appease them and try to stay out of their bad graces. And how do you do that? Well, you build them temples, you offer sacrifices, and you try your best to be pious. All right. So if that's a kind of summary of Mesopotamian religion, today we're going to go past the history and the mythology that we did last time and talk about kingship, the rise of kingship, and the rule of law. And in the email I sent, I then talked about covenants and covenant patterns and making these covenants. And as I look through the time for the class, that's going to have to be next time. So law is actually going to take us two attempts. We're going to do one on the kingship, the rise of kingship, the role of the king, and the law code of Hammurabi up through that point. And then next time we'll talk about covenants, covenant patterns. And in both cases, we're going to spend a lot of time comparing to the Bible. Now, I haven't done that often. Often these religion classes have been for themselves, to learn this one religion with no real reference to other religious traditions, etc. But in this case, these particular religious customs influenced the Bible so strongly, and it's something that's so important to our culture that I'm going to spend a little bit of time specifically making comparisons to the Bible as we go. So, in Mesopotamia, we begin with the city-state. So Mesopotamian religion is dominated by city-states at the beginning. Each city is independent. And so we're going to talk about how kingship arises in this context. So we have a bunch of relatively independent cities that are each their own nation. And those cities had to do certain things to make them successful. As they grew in population, they had to feed their populace. They had to have farms outside. To do that, they had to have canals and irrigation works. And so one of the first things the king is in charge of is organizing public works, the canals, the irrigation ditches. But he's also military. He's in charge of protecting the people of his city-state from any aggression from either wandering tribes or other cities. He's also a religious leader. So from our perspective, that last is the one we care most about, but they're all interconnected. And so the way the religious connection worked with the city-states is the Mesopotamians believed that each city-state had its own patron deity. So there was a god of Akkad, there was a god of Ur, there was a god of Babylon, and each city had its own patron deity. They believed in all these deities, but each one had a patron. And the way the patron deity worked is the god lived in the city, protected that city, and the city could therefore only be destroyed if A, a more powerful god attacked and overcame them, or B, the patron deity left because the people ticked them off, did something bad to tick off the patron deity, and then the patron deity would leave, abandon the people, and then they could be destroyed. You'll notice that same sort of thing happening in the Bible. When Jerusalem is destroyed, why? It was because Jehovah abandoned us, but he was our patron, and we weren't worshiping him the way we were supposed to, so he abandoned us, and the city was destroyed. That's exactly how the Mesopotamians do this, and think about this. So the king is the leader of the people. His central religious job was to make sure that didn't happen. So the king was the appeaser of the deity par excellence. All the people had to appease the deity to keep the deity's favor, but the king was in charge of that. And so the way you had to appease the deity is you had to have a temple, and you had to supply the temple with sacrifices and priests. And so the king was in charge of that, and that means that he was the chief priest. So there's often references in the Bible to kings and priests, to a connection between kingship and priesthood. It's especially present in the figure of Melchizedek. But there's a connection between priesthood and kingship in Mesopotamia that then connects to the biblical feeling. And so what we'll notice is that the king will assign family members to be priests at different temples. The king will be in charge of certain rituals himself, and the king is the central person in charge of marshaling the labor necessary to perform the sacrifices and the feasts and to build the temple. So the king's religious role is a temple builder, a temple maintainer, and a priest in his society, a warlord to protect them from war, and a person who takes care of the aqueducts and does other civic works. Something I was going to say and I can't remember.
How could one person have skills in so many disparate areas?
So I don't think the question was how could one person have skills in so many disparate areas, because those are a wide range of areas. And the answer is delegation. I mean, I don't think the king did all these things himself, but he had to be in charge of making sure all those things happened, because if they failed, he was the one that was responsible. So if the crops failed because of a flood, the king is in charge, because the flood wouldn't come if the gods weren't mad, and the gods wouldn't be mad if the king had been doing his religious duties correctly. So the king was in charge of making sure the religious duties were done, because any disaster was his fault, war was his fault, and so he was in charge of each of these areas. And that was the other one I forgot, and law. So the king had to establish a law code to govern the people, so that there were crimes and there were punishment for crimes, and he was in charge of the judge. So you can imagine someone who's the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the law legislator, all kind of rolled into one. So he had a big job, and it wasn't an easy job. I mean, to some extent, if I was going to live in Mesopotamia, I wouldn't want to, because I'd rather live today with medicine and low infant mortality rates and things. Sometimes we wax philosophically nostalgic about the past. The past was short, people's lives in the past were short, brutal, and unhappy. But if I had to live in the past, I'd probably want to be the king, just because I at least was sure I wasn't going to get, I was going to get fed in the morning. On the other hand, if a natural disaster happened, I would be blamed for it and probably killed. People would try to assassinate me. And so it wasn't an easy job, and he had a lot of things he was in charge of. All right, so one of the evidences for the king's role as a temple builder, so I said one of his jobs is to make sure that God stays in the city. That means we need to build for the God a house where the God can live in the city, and in that house would be a statue of the deity. And the king's role as a temple builder is illustrated in a long series of texts, because one of the things the king liked to do was proclaim to the world that he had built a temple. I built the temple of Inanna. I built the temple of Enkidu, or of Enlil. And they would proclaim their temple building chops in these stelas that they would erect. And so this individual, Arvid Kapperlund, I think that's how you say his name, went through and read all these and noticed that they had a lot of things in common. So if you just read these stelas, they all follow a pattern. And this is a fairly trivial pattern. It's obvious, and you'd expect it to show up just by accident in lots of places. But there is a pattern, almost a formula, to the way these I built a temple stelas work. So the first is some indication is given that a temple has to be built. I mean, in English that doesn't sound terribly interesting, but when you read the text, what usually that entails is some sort of a vision, some sort of a dream, an omen. The God will come and visit and say, "This is my home." And these parts were important, because what makes a spot sacred? Well, the God visited it. The God touched the place. Something sacred happened here. And so that's that first moment. The stele opens with, there's a place where, 5 people looked up into heaven and saw Inanna in vision, glorious, and she descended and said, this mountain is my home, build my temple here. Well, now that's a place worthy of pilgrimage. So the text opens with a description of why the temple had to be built. God came down, a vision happened, they saw some birds flying upside down, and it was an omen. Whatever it is, they have some sort of omen, and the temple has to be built. So the king, no one else, the king goes there, and God tells him what to do, and he usually spends the night. So there's a dream sequence, very similar to Samuel. Do you remember Samuel's dream in the temple? But also Moses' trip to Mount Sinai, where he spends 40 days and 40 nights. The king will go to the spot where this omen took place and will say, well, I got to build a temple here. I got to find out what we need to do. And he'll spend the night there. And he'll have some sort of a visionary experience during the night. A dream or some other event will transpire while he sleeps there in the temple location. And during that dream, God will tell him what to do and will give him a plan. What's important about this is that the text is implying that the temple was not the king's plan, the temple was not mankind's plan, the temple was God's plan, and God told us what it should look like, how it should be built, what its dimensions would be. All those things were revealed to the king by God, usually during his overnight dream. Again, if we're comparing to the biblical text, which is what we're doing all the way through this, this is Moses in Exodus and Leviticus, where he goes to the mountaintop and God reveals the plan for the tabernacle. You'll notice David and Solomon doing something similar. Solomon goes to the spot and dreams and has a prayer, and he has that whole, asking for wisdom moment, and then he decides to build a temple. And so God tells him what to do and indicates his plan. And then the king announces that he's going to build a temple. Again, this is the purpose of the stele. Well, the Stelius to say it's been done. But this is when the king comes down off the mountain and says, I chatted with God, I had this dream, God wants us to build a temple. People, we are going to build a temple, and by the way, I'm the king, so you're going to, do the work that I tell you to do. So there's the announcement that happens. And then a master builder is engaged, cedars from Lebanon, building stones, gold, silver is procured for the task. And the king will list this in gory detail. I acquired this much gold from this place and this many cedars of Lebanon from this place so that I could build a glorious house for the God. What he's trying to do is hype up the house because he's trying to convince the people. And he probably believes, so he's probably trying to convince the God too. But from a practical standpoint, the king needs to convince the people that he is building a sufficiently glorious house that the God is going to like it and hang out and stay and not abandon them. So it's very important for the king to list all the riches of the house to convince the people that the house is sufficiently rich and lush. And yeah, David?
In lower Mesopotamia, they're bringing cedars from Lebanon?
So this this pattern was developed for the ancient Near East because you will find these texts from very early that follow this pattern and very late. You'll see them in Assyria. And so the reference to cedars of Lebanon is probably from northern Mesopotamia and later. But cedars of Lebanon are used way over in Babylon. They will reference the need for cedars, specifically from Lebanon, just like they will in the Bible. And they do it in Egypt too. Egypt talks about needing cedars from Lebanon.
That's a lot farther than going to Jerusalem.
It is, and they would. So there was a very extensive trade network, but it was probably later. I don't know when that was established, but I'm guessing you wouldn't see this in early Sumeria, but you probably would see it in later Assyria, etc.
And
So I have a mic here.
oh, okay.
I can pass around for people who have questions.
Okay, another question. Did the Mesopotamian societies have recognized prophets distinguished from the king, or maybe from priests, or?
I don't see an early reference to that, and I don't know what a prophet would be in Mesopotamia. Clearly, the Israelites did. A prophet was distinct from a king from Samuel on, but I don't know.
Well, even the Greeks did. To
Yeah.
some degree.
But they're later than this.
Oh, much, yeah.
Well, we have texts from the Greeks that are later than this. The Greeks are earlier than this, but we don't have written sources.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of a distinction in early Mesopotamia. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just don't know anything about it. I'm sorry, David. All right, so the king will list all of his building, and then he will list the offerings and the dedications, and they will offer this many sacrifices. And then after the sacrifices, there's a certain set of sacrifices that dedicate the temple, but then he will list the sacrifices that will then happen on a daily basis thereafter. So that's the setting of the norms. The people will gather together. God comes to his new house, and it's accepted. The people will see some sort of vision that shows that God has come to his home and accepted the home and is now living there. And that's beyond the statue usually. The statue is a symbol for the deity's presence, but they will often describe it, in Israel they describe a pillar of fire, a cloud, this sort of thing. And then the king is blessed and promised everlasting dominion. So the relationship between the king and the people and the God is circular. The king builds the God a house. The God promises the king that his line will continue and the city will be protected, and therefore his kingship will continue because of the work that the king has done to protect the God, and that in turn protects the people, which makes the people who live there willing to support the king. So you'll notice how the king is leveraging his religious convictions to acquire the support and services of the people through this religious enterprise. So again, these texts with this pattern illustrate the important role of temple building for kingship. And you will again notice the pattern, including the king is blessed and promised everlasting dominion. That whole pattern is played out in the biblical text where David is promised that his line will rule in Israel forever because he wants to build God a house. So your house, your reign will last forever. So this entire pattern can be seen in Israel. There's even been some enterprising Mormons who have pointed out that in the building of the Kirtland Temple, the entire pattern is repeated, down to God appearing in the house and the visions that people had. Make of that whatever you would like. So, the king is the military leader, the lawgiver, the canal builder, and the religious priest and temple builder, which secured his rule and reign. Now again, this is all based on this idea that city-states are individual houses for individual gods. And it actually creates a certain barrier to the rise of empire, because each city-state has a different patron god, a different king with a different priesthood running that temple and being in charge of that temple, and the people's loyalty are very much to their city-state. And so you can imagine this is the tension between the states' rights and the Federalists in the early formation of the United States. There was a tension there, and as we try to build larger empires in this region, we will fight this feeling of individual kingships and individual states. The first king to do this, to unite multiple city-states under a single ruler, is Sargon the Great, who, just nomenclaturally, as I used to confuse with Sargon the First, Sargon the First I would confuse with Sargon the Second, and then I would end up with a Sargon the Third, because you'd think the first Sargon was the first Sargon. He's not. There's Sargon the Great, then Sargon the First, then Sargon the Second, which is just confusing enough to mess everybody up. But Sargon the Great is the first guy to do this, and you look at how early this is. We're talking, 2300 BC, when he will first unite several of these city-states. Sargon has interesting mythology and history surrounding him. Now, we don't have a lot of contemporary accounts from Sargon's life and reign. So most of what we think we know about Sargon comes from years later. And that means that he's become a mythological character. And therefore what they say about him is, to some extent, a bit suspect. We don't know how relevant, how correct some of this is. But there are contemporary sources for him. He's a real king. We really know he lived. He really lived when they think he lived. He's in the king list, and we have monuments and things from his time in his reign. We just don't have a lot. What we do have is a lot of stuff written about him, some of it contradictory, years later, because he becomes a mythological figure. So here is a story about him from, I think, 700 BC, 800 BC, somewhere between 700 and 800 BC, where it says it's an earlier text, and it probably is earlier, but how much earlier is up for debate. And it claims that it's actually an autobiography where Sargon the Great is telling you his life story. That's probably not true. And here's what he says. He says, "My mother was a high priestess. My father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is I cannot say these Mesopotamian names, Azupiranu, which is situated on the banks of the Euphrates. My high priestess mother conceived me. In secret she bore me." Now he doesn't say why it's a secret. And unfortunately the text breaks off right when it would get interesting. But she bore him in secret. So presumably there was some reason that people might fear the child of this priest politically, so she has to bear him in secret. "And she set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid." This is great, isn't it?
Bitumen?
Bitumen, yeah. And she cast me into the river, which rose over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Isn't that great? Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. That almost sounds like a sort of sexual liaison he has with the goddess, which it wouldn't surprise me if that's actually what he means. "And for 4 years I exercised kingship," and then the tablet breaks off, and it's really unfortunate because that's right when he should explain how this person who seems like a commoner but was actually from royal blood of the priestess becomes king. These are the sort of stories you get when someone who doesn't actually deserve to be king becomes king and then tries to justify his reign. In fact, Sargon's name means something like "I'm the legitimate king," and it sounds a lot like, "Thou doth protest a bit too much." I think what we have here is a story of a commoner who becomes king and then tries to retroactively claim that he was the child of a priestess, possibly even a sort of virgin birth. "My father I knew not." Right? There are other versions, though, which give his father, so etc. Now, I can't go on. I mean, we already laughed about the parallels, but for those of you who don't know the biblical story well, we might as well point them out. "And the child grew, and she brought him unto the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water." So I guess I jumped ahead a little bit. Moses was born when the Pharaoh wanted to kill the Israelite firstborn children, or not the firstborn, but just the male children born during a certain time, I think it is, specifically because the Israelites were becoming too numerous, and they're slaves, so he's going to kill all the male children. And Moses' mother wants to save her child, so she bears him in secret. And when the people come to get him and then he's in danger of being found and killed, she puts him in a reed basket, which she seals with bitumen, places in the river Nile, and he floats down the river and is picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter. And now notice in the other one, it's a royal person who has a child, a priestess who has a child, sends him down the river, and he's raised by a commoner and then becomes king. In this case, it's the other way. It's a commoner who has a child, he floats down the river, and is picked up by royalty and raised by royalty. But the parallels between the story are just too many to be coincidental, and then this fun line here. She said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses means in Hebrew drawn from the water. It happens to mean in Egyptian, son of nobody. So we have a really fun pun on this name that the Bible doesn't actually completely fill out. In Egyptian, Moses means Mesis, son of nobody, and Ra-Mesis means son of Ra. So Ramses is the son of Ra, Moses is the son of nobody, and he also was drawn from the water, so he's the son of something drawn from the water, son of the water, drawn from the water, if you kind of combine the two languages that are happening there. And if you go back to Sargon, you'll notice the text says, "The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water." The name is Moses' name is even in the text, for heaven's sakes. So, yeah, what were you going to say? Go ahead, David.
You said this text that you're describing is from 700-800 BCE.
Yes.
Right? But at that point, you start wondering if it could even have been influenced by the story of Moses, which presumably had been more or less formulated at that point. Do you know if these basic elements exist in any earlier texts?
There's a Greek version of this. Euripides, not Euripides, but one of the Iliad and Odyssey characters has a story very similar to this in their life. There's a common motif that floats around all over the place. They probably all have an earlier origin that is influencing all of them together. The date of this text is such that it presumably happened. So here's the $10 million religious question, especially when you bring this up to people who are very invested in the biblical text, religious fundamentalists who believe the text is perfect as it is, etc. When you bring this up to them, the $10 million question is who influenced who. The issue is Sargon lived a long time before Moses. If this is an accurate story of his life, he came first. The text we have for this account of his life was written after presumably Moses lived. Ergo, Moses could have influenced this text. However, this text, when we start dating the biblical text, is earlier than the version of the story of Moses's, I don't remember who the author is, but when you author it, E.J., whatever, and you try to date it, that text and the Hebrew it uses, you can try to date when it was written based on the archaic nature of the Hebrew. Some of the texts are early, some are later. That text was written probably after this account. So this account is of a person who lived before Moses in a text that was written before the text of Moses. However, this text that we have would have been after Moses' life, so you can posit influence in all directions. It's hard, though, to figure out why the Babylonians and the Assyrians would be interested in a small desert tribe's myth about Moses as an origin for their story about their greatest king, who, just in terms of cultural influence, they have primacy. So if you don't have a religious bone in the fight, you would presume influence went the other direction. But if you have a religious bone in the fight, it is possible to assume influence going the other direction and save your religious conviction in that sense. So I don't think this is a foolproof argument either way. If you have a reason to believe in the primacy of the Moses account, you can posit influence going the other direction, if you really want to. So that's just fascinating to me. I mean, the connection to Moses drawn from the water and the birth of Sargon is just fascinating. Before we get to Maram Simna, let's tell you what Sargon did. He rose up. This Ishtar has he becomes the cupbearer of the king. And the story just gets better and better. Let me see if I can actually read. I might as well read this. Instead of just trying to summarize it, why don't I try to read this account in a little bit better detail. Okay. The extant version is incomplete, but the surviving fragments name Sargon's father as Laboom. So this is, again, the contradiction. My father I knew not, but these other texts say his father was a guy named Laboom. After a break in the text skips to a place where Ur-Zababa, king of Kish, awakens after a dream, the contents of which are not revealed in the surviving portion of the tablet. For an unknown reason, Ur-Zababa appoints Sargon as his cupbearer. Soon after this, Ur-Zababa invites Sargon and to his chambers to discuss the dream. Now, maybe I don't have to point this out, but this is Joseph in Egypt, complete with the cupbearer of the king, interpreting the king's dreams, etc., right? So let's see. Ur-Zababa invites Sargon to his chambers to discuss the dream. And then Sargon has a dream after this involving the goddess Ishtar, which we already read about. That Ishtar shows up in the other version we read too, where he was drawn from the river, and then Ishtar is connected to this story. But the favor of the goddess Ishtar, and the drowning of Ur-Zababa by the goddess. So Sargon has a dream where Ur-Zababa is drowned by the goddess. Now, it doesn't say that Sargon came to the king and said, "King, I'm going to drown you and replace you." It's like Sargon came to the king and said, "King, I love you, you're my friend, but I had this horrible dream where you were drowned by the goddess." And the king's like, "Sargon, you're dangerous to me because that means that the goddess wants you to kill me and replace me." So the king tries to kill Sargon. So this story, we've got Joseph in here, but now it should remind you of David and Saul. David is supposed to be king, but he loves Saul and doesn't want to hurt Saul, and so he's just waiting for God to make him king, in his own due time. And Saul's busy trying to kill David because he's afraid of him becoming king. Well, that's exactly what we have here. Sargon and Ur-Zababa, and Ur-Zababa is, trying to kill Sargon to keep him from becoming king because of this dream. Okay, so Ur-Zababa orders Sargon murdered by the hands of Belish Tikal, whoever that is, the chief smith. But Inanna prevents it, demanding that Sargon stop at the gates because of his being polluted with blood. So there's some sort of a play on you have to stop at the gates, and because of that he's not where he's supposed to be and doesn't die from this plot to murder him. So when Sargon returns to Ur-Zababa, undead, the king becomes frightened again and decides to send Sargon to the king of Lugal-Zag-Zi of Uruk with a message on a clay tablet asking him to slay Sargon. So now we have Sargon carrying a letter with his own death warrant on it to this other king. Let's see. The legend then breaks off. This is so frustrating. At this exact point, presumably the missing sections describe Sargon becoming king of Kish and Lugal both. So we do know that the two kingdoms that he conquers first are Kish and Lugal. And the story just has him headed to Lugal with a message to the king of Lugal to kill him. So we can imagine some version of this story that would be just really fun, where he shows up in Lugal and he looks at the letter before giving it to the king and realizes what it says, and then there's some plot to save his own life, aided by the goddess, where he ends up killing the king of Lugal and becoming king of Lugal, and then going back to the other to Kish and slaying Ur-Zababa and becoming king. We can imagine this wonderful, it would be a wonderful story, wouldn't it? I wish I knew the rest of the story. So now we have a king who has conquered 2 city-states, and he very quickly conquers a whole lot more. And by his death, he has created the first kind of big collection of city-states all under one ruler. And the problem he has then is, how do you unify these people so that they will accept you as ruler? Well, the first thing is you become a king of kings. So the phrase in Isaiah, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, this is the beginning of that idea, because he's a king, but he's not just a king of people, he's a king of other kings. So each governor of each city is still a king, but now they're united under an emperor, a king of kings. The next thing you have to do is, if the king owes his power to this religious authority, you have to build temples in all these places, and you have to somehow install yourself in the ritual cult. So he takes his daughter, let me see if I can find her name, Enheduanna, and he makes her the priestess of the moon god Sin at Ur. Ur is one of the more important early cities. It was had a lot of influence and was famous, and we've probably talked a lot about Ur before. In fact, the Bible will call the Babylonians, the people of Ur, the Chaldees, that sort of thing, Chaldeans. So Ur is a big deal, and Sin is a big deal to Sargon's ancestors. And so he sends his daughter down there and makes her the priestess of Ur. Now, this is another thing to point out. Notice that the king has the power to install and set up the priests for the different religious cults. So the king is a priest and is over the cults and can establish who the rightful priest should be, which establishes the primacy of the king over the religious tradition. Now, in Israel, it works the other way. Well, it's supposed to. According to the biblical authors, it's supposed to. It didn't always, though. But you'll remember Samuel anoints the king and decides who is king. The religious leader is over the king. And then we have the high priest of the temple cult, who is separate, and the king was not supposed to be assigning temple priesthood. And when the king does that, there's all sorts of claims that the priesthood is illegitimate, and it creates fights and infighting in Israel's history. And so the king shouldn't be establishing the priest's identity that has its own chain of delivery through Aaron. And in Mesopotamia, however, the king is in charge of the priesthood. And so he's using that authority to make himself in charge not only of his own city-state, Kish's priesthood, but of all these other priesthoods. And the first thing he does, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could try to establish your supremacy by assuming the supremacy of your god over the others. He doesn't do that. Sargon instead worships all of these gods and claims to be involved in making sure each of the gods stay put in each of the cities and appeasing all of them. And he does that by establishing family members in priesthood roles in each of these places. Now, a fun kind of side note, this person, Enheduanna, is a poet. She writes praise poems for the king and for the gods. She especially writes a lot of poetry about the wonders of Sin, the moon god. And she is the first poet, author, we can put a name to and say, this person wrote this text in history. And so the first author in history is a woman, Enheduanna, the priestess of Sin and the daughter of Sargon. And I would, if I had some time, I would love to read some of her hymns. They're fun. I'm going to have to pick and choose what we're going to talk about. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, he is interesting to us because he starts something a little different than what we've seen before, and that is this divine kingship, the concept that a king is a god. We haven't seen that before. Now, the kings that came before this weren't gods. They were the gods' priests. They were in charge of appeasing the gods. And now we're taking this huge step and saying the king isn't just the person in charge of appeasing the god, the person closest to the god. The king is a god. How can you make that link? I mean, it seems nonsensical to us. I think the first thing we have to realize is that the Mesopotamian concept of what was divine is very different from ours. We're very influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. We're very influenced by the Greek tradition of the prime mover, etc. And all of those traditions together create a concept of a God that is so different from us and almost unapproachable that the concept of a human as a God makes no sense at all. But the Egyptians had been doing this for a long time. And they probably had influence and connection with Mesopotamia. So a theory is they borrowed this from Egypt. But I think that their own religion was ready for it. So if we look at Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is working for his own kind of divinity, and we have these great heroes. The concept of a hero and the concept of a god are not that far apart. The hero in the epic and the king as a god are close already. A god, remember, is a personified force of nature. They bring the floods, they bring the rains, and the king brings the wars. So again, the step between the personified force that brings the rain and the personified force that commands the armies. I mean, to a peasant, the king looks a lot like a force of nature. And again, the step isn't really that large. It would have made a lot of sense to them. So Naram-Sin deifies himself. The other thing he does is he depicts himself with these massive biceps. And one researcher said he looks really sexy. And I think what he's doing here is he's equating himself with the epic heroes, Gilgamesh, the mighty warrior with the strong muscles who could accomplish so many things. Again, that was a step, I believe, to the deification. So let's talk briefly about how they deified himself. This is the victory stele of Naram-Sin. The first thing you'll notice is, he's climbing up this ramp into the city, trotting over under his enemies, under his feet. This is his position as a war. But if you look at his head, he's wearing a crown with these horns. This crown was specifically reserved for deities before. The other thing we should note about this stele is usually the gods were fighting for the people. They would often depict the gods actually taking part in the battle and fighting for the people. The gods are absent in this, except for Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin is the god fighting in the battle. And the other deities are kind of present, but they're at the top. At the top of the stele, you see these stars. The pictures of these stars are right here. These are the symbols of the god's presence in the battle. So the gods are there, but they're kind of off in the distance, and the local present force is Naram-Sin himself. Then he takes the following new titles: the god of Akkad, king of the four quarters, king of the universe. Akkad is the new capital that Sargon creates for this is what we call the Akkadians, the rise of the Akkadians. Akkad is his capital, and he creates the capital. He actually creates a new city. That's the other thing Sargon did that I should have mentioned. To establish his kingship, he creates a new capital. Now, this is completely different. Remember, each city was the home of a different god, and each city was its own thing, and you were kings of the god. And when he tries to make himself king over a large group of them, he actually founds a new city. That's something we hadn't seen before. It will be repeated, though, but it's new here. Yeah?
Do we know if Akkad was a Sumerian speaker or an Akkadian speaker?
Akkadian.
He did speak Akkadian.
Yes. And in fact, one of the things he does to cement his reign is he is the one who creates the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian. He changes the official language. And one of the reasons we can read these languages is because when he made the shift, all the scribes had to learn the new language. And we have a whole bunch of scribal texts from the time period where they'd have text written in Akkadian and Sumerian side by side as they were trying to learn how to go from one to the other. And so this is where the shift to Akkadian takes place, is during Sargon, as we get an empire. So now Naram-Sin becomes the god of Akkad. And so each city has its own patron deity. Sargon has created a new city, and the king is the god of that city. And this isn't actually very different. What do you do if you're a Mesopotamian and you want to have a good life? Well, you go and you appease the gods. And if you appease the gods and you're nice to them, maybe they'll be nice to you. So what do we do if we want to appease the king? We go to Akkad and we appease the king. And he's the god, and he's the god of Akkad, and we appease him, and maybe we can have a good life. I mean, this is, again, not as much of a stretch as it sounds to us. This is extremely important for the biblical text, though, so we'll get to this in just a second. What is really interesting is how he deifies himself. You see this symbol here? The cuneiform is written by putting little wedges in clay, and originally they were pictograms, and then the pictograms became increasingly abstract over time. These are the way artists draw the tablets, and they'll often draw off to the side because the tablets are curved. And so if you look down on it, you can't see the side. You can only see the front. So they'll draw it like you would see it looking down, and they would draw off to the side. What's happening is the text curves around the edge of the tablets. This is how they draw that. And it's just an illustration. But this here, it shows up here too, this symbol. It's a picture of a star. Specifically the star Venus, we believe. There's reasons for that. And it has no phonetic equivalent. They call it a dinger. And if you're reading the text, each of these symbols is a syllable. So you have one symbol per syllable, not one syllable per sound. One symbol per syllable. And this one symbol has no phonetic value, but it's a marker that what follows is divine. So you put this star symbol next to the names of deities. So remember when I said before the deities were present in the stele because they're the stars at the top? Well, those stars are symbols of deities, and you put them next to the names of deities. And what Naram Sin does that the other people before him hadn't done is he starts putting this star in front of his name everywhere. So everywhere his name shows up in a tablet, it becomes prefaced by a star. So he thinks he's divine. And the symbol of his divinity is the star. It's going to become important later. In later Assyrian, the star is further simplified, and this version of it here is the Assyrian version of the Sumerian version of the same sign. Again, it's the phonetic, has no phonetic value, it's just the star. Shortly after Naram Sin, after his reign, and we think he gets blamed for this, but we actually, the record seems to indicate that he made it through his reign just fine. But shortly after his life, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. And he gets blamed, and some of the authors will blame his deification as the reason. Others will blame, he destroyed a temple and made this god mad or something. But they have an excuse for why the gods abandoned them and the Gadaeans were able to destroy them. And they have these texts that describe what will happen. Its town paths grew nothing but weeds. Its chariot roads grew nothing but the wailing plant. This is what happened to Akkad after its destruction. Moreover, on its cannon boat, town paths and landings, no human being walks because of the wild goats, the venom snakes, the mountain scorpions. The plains where grew the heart-soothing plants grew nothing but the reed of tears. Akkad, instead of its sweet flowing water, there flowed bitter water. Who said I would dwell in the city found not a good dwelling place. Who said I would lie down in Akkad found not a good sleeping place. Akkad is actually a city we still haven't found. It's probably somewhere under Baghdad, which may be why we haven't found it. But this is a text describing its utter and complete destruction and its non-return to a dwelling after. Now, those of you who are familiar with the biblical texts should recognize this. It is familiar. There are passages in Isaiah specifically that describe the destruction of Babylon and use almost the same passage, including venomous snakes and the whole bit, and they will describe the destruction of the Babylons, the coming destruction of the Babylons, in these terms, where nothing will ever live there again, nothing will ever grow there again. And again, if we're talking about the primacy of the text, these texts are many, many thousands of years earlier. At least hundreds of years earlier. I think thousands of years, depending on when this was written. The event it describes was thousands of years earlier. So again, I think we're seeing influence, and especially when we're talking about the destruction of Babylon, it makes sense. So now let's turn to Isaiah 13 and 14. I think we have to do this. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Is there any chance that Akkad was actually on the side of Babylon? It's close. It's better Akkad than it's close to Babylon.
I don't know. No one knows where Acadia is, so I can't tell you because we don't know. It's a lost city. If we find it, it'll be a big deal. But Acadia is a city we don't know its actual location yet.
I just want to say something. I'm just keeping the microphone here because that way Jane doesn't have to walk out. But you want to ask a question?
If anyone has a comment or question, raise your hand and I'll make sure Dave passes that mic your direction. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with Isaiah 13 and 14, but as Unitarians and as Universalists especially, we have a kind of a stake in that particular game theologically, because this is where the entire Lucifer myth comes from. So we care about this text for theological reasons, I think, and it's a description of the destruction of Babylon, one influenced by the text we just read. So I think it's important to make some comparisons here just for fun. Before I do, let's outline the text so we know kind of what we're dealing with, right? Chapter 13 is about the destruction of Babylon. Many commentators have compared it to the second coming of Christ and the destruction of the world before the second coming. And the reason they make that comparison is because the text waxes very philosophical about the destruction of Babylon. The stars will fall from the heavens, the earth will shake. It sounds more like the end of the world than it does the end of Babylon. But it says it's about Babylon, and then it talks about things that sound more like the end of the world. And so if you read it thousands of years later when Babylon doesn't really exist anymore, it's very tempting to say Babylon is just an esoteric name for the evil world, right? And so what you do is you read this text, you plug Babylon in for the world, and you read the whole text as if it's about something completely detached from its historical context. But the text claims to be about the destruction of Babylon. We'll see if we can put it back in that context for a minute. And I think it should be relevant to anyone who cares that it borrows language directly from a text describing the destruction of Akkad, which to me makes it far more likely to sit back in its historical context. All right, so God will choose and restore Israel. So Babylon will be destroyed. After Babylon is destroyed, God will choose Israel. And when you are chosen and the Babylon is destroyed, you'll say this about the Babylonian king. So the text actually says, you will say this. And then it's got a long description of things you will say to the Babylonian king. And then it's got some stuff about the destruction of Assyria and the destruction of Palestine. And we're going to ignore that because that's actually, just because it's in the same chapter, the chapter headings don't actually have logical breaks. That's the start of a completely different thing, unrelated. So we're just going to end at the end of this 14, 4 through 23. Now we're going to read a bit of this because, yeah, go ahead, David.
Palestine, I mean the Philippines?
Yes, in this case, I believe. I have to go back and check because I didn't, because that's a different chunk, I didn't preface the, I need to go back and remember what those verses are about.
I'll check the
but I believe so.
Yeah, I'll check the Hebrew too.
And I took these slides from when I taught Isaiah, and at the time I had prepped each of those other sections too, and that was 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't remember. So, all right, Isaiah 13. The noise of a multitude in the mountains. Now, we have to read this, right? Like as a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord, and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. So what we have is a people stirred up by the Lord in an ally between the Medes and a group of other tribes, which we know is what happened, who come down and destroy the Babylonians. And if you go back to the Curse of Akkad, it describes the Gadaeans in almost identical language. We didn't quote it, but the Gadaeans are described as a tribe, an uncivilized tribe living out in the wilderness. And frankly, the description, the best analogy I can make is, you know the monkeys from The Wizard of Oz? The flying monkeys? That's how it describes the Gudeans. And they sweep in and they destroy the Acadia. And here we have the Medes sweeping in and destroying Acadia. And in both cases, the Gudeans who destroy Acadia and the Medes who destroy Babylon are described as the tool of the god to enact his wrath upon the people. Yes?
What's that mean?
Which one?
From the destruction of Akkad?
Akkad, Acadia.
No, but the ones who destroy.
Oh, the Gudeans, I believe.
What's the first consonant?
Gud, G-U-D.
Oh, Gude. Okay.
Yeah. But I'm basing that on a great courses lecture I listened to the last 2 months, where I heard it said, you're presuming I'm understanding what she said, right? So,
I was just thinking it could be an M, in which case it could even be a cognative B.
No, I don't think. They're very different people, different times, in fact.
Yeah.
The Medes will show up, but we'll get to the Medes. When we do Mesopotamian history, they will influence Mesopotamia too. So, and Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation, neither shall the Arabian pitch his tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there, but the wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, the owls shall dwell there, and the satyrs shall dance there, and the wild beasts of the island shall cry in their desolate houses, and the dragons in their pleasant places. I think dragons is one of those fun King James mistranslations for serpents, which, by the way, we showed up in the other text. And their time is neither to come, nor the days shall not be prolonged. Now, if you don't think those two texts sound familiar, right, we've got a problem. And then we get to 14. Where we describe this individual. Now, this is where Lucifer comes from. I know this is a tangent, but dang it, I love this tangent, and I got to have it because I think it's related. So, here is what it says. Remember, when God chooses Israel and destroys Babylon, you will say this to the king of Babylon. So, the first thing we know about this person is he is specifically called the king of Babylon. Now, if you read the text where Babylon is this moniker for the evil world, then the king of the evil world is the devil. But if you read it just as what it says, it's the king of Babylon. He is the oppressor of people. He ruled the nations in anger. He persecuted, and none hindereth. And then he is persecuted. So he ruled the nations in anger, meaning he was a persecutor, and therefore he will be persecuted. And no one will stop him, just as no one stopped him in life from persecuting. And the dead will rise up to meet him at his death. Now that image is very insightful, because what it describes is a person who in his evil wars caused the death of thousands and thousands will one day himself die. And when he dies, he will go to hell, the land of the dead, Hades. And when he gets there, Sheol, the dead will rise up to meet him. And all those people whose lives he ruined will rise up, and he won't be well received, right? Because here's a person who caused all this suffering, now walking up to all the people who he abused, and they'll be there to beat the tar out of him. That's kind of the image I get. And when he dies, he'll become weak, just like those he slew. Worms will cover his grave. And now, up to that point, that really doesn't sound an awful lot like any sort of myth that you could apply to the devil. I mean, try to apply any variant of the devil mythology you can think of to those texts, and it's very hard. Because, how did the devil live, rule kingdoms, and then physically die, and then go down to hell, and then be met by the people he slew in his life? That is not a story of the devil. And then out of nowhere, we get a passage that says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? You made the nations to tremble, but you were weak," right? That passage, taken in isolation, sounds an awful lot like it's about the devil. After all, it has the word Lucifer in it, right? We'll come back to that in a minute. But then immediately after that passage that seems to make no continuous sense, which is often taken as a proof text out of context as a reference to the devil, with no reference to the passages before it or after it. So now the ones before it don't make sense that way. The ones after it won't either. Because it says, "You weakened the nations, but you think you will make yourself a god, but you'll be brought down to the grave. You didn't let the prisoners go free, so you will have no tomb, and your body will lie in the street without ever having proper burial, and you will end up with no children or posterity to rule in your place after you." Again, the rest of that maybe makes sense. You thought you'd make yourself a god. Some of the Lucifer myths are all about that, right? He's someone who wants to make himself God, who therefore falls from heaven. That's the story of the fallen angel. The entire mythos of fallen angel Satan in all of Christianity comes from these verses. But we just talked about Naram-Sin, the king of Akkad who tried to make himself a god. Hammurabi after him will do the same thing. The rulers of Ur-3 will do the same thing. Babylonian kings have a history of trying to make themselves into gods. And for an Israelite, that's nonsensical and stupid and full of pride. And so you who thought you were a god are going to die like any other man, and you're going to meet all the people who you killed, and it's not going to be a good time for you. That's a great lament to the king of Babylon. All of it matches the king of Babylon, including the trying to make yourself a god, except this one passage, Lucifer, son of the morning. So let's try to make sense of the Lucifer, son of the morning passage. The Hebrew here doesn't have the word Lucifer in it anywhere. Lucifer is a Latin term. Where in the world did the devil end up with a Latin name, by the way? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that there would actually be a fallen angel who just happened to have a Latin name. The Hebrew is Hallel ben Sha'ar, is the shining one, son of the dawn. Literally, and almost without doubt, a reference to Venus. Venus is the shining star, the brightest star in the sky, and it's the son of the dawn because it's the star that rises just before the sun does. Because of the orbits of Earth and Venus, Venus always shows up between the Earth and the sun, and so it's either early in the morning or late in the evening, and you see it on the horizon just before or just after the sun rises. And so the shining herald of the dawn is Venus. Lucifer is the Latin word for Venus. It's a correct translation of the text. It's the translation that shows up in the Vulgate, where in Latin it just says Venus, son of the dawn. Lucifer, son of the dawn. And in English, for some reason, we decided instead of translating it Venus, son of the dawn, which would have prevented a whole bunch of confusion, we borrowed the Latin from the Vulgate into the King James, and it became Lucifer, son of the dawn, and Lucifer then became a name for the devil, and everything snowballs from here. And it's not quite that simple because I think Origen also connected this passage to the devil in the early Christian commentaries. What is it really about? Well, this is the current kind of scholastic view. The second eulogy introduces the ancient myth of the fall from grace of rebellious deities. The closest parallel is that of Phaeton, son of Helios, the sun, or of Eos, the dawn, who come to grief attempting to drive the chariot of the sun. They lose control of the vehicle and they're struck down by Zeus's thunderbolts. Likely several of the ancient Greek myths, this one may have derived from a Phoenician Canaanite source inspired by the rise of Venus in the morning star and its rapid disappearance at sunrise. So Venus rises in the morning, it's all bright, it's all shiny, it's wonderful, and as soon as the sun comes up, it vanishes from the sky. Isaiah is doing something far more clever than referencing a myth of Icarus and these other kind of falling from heaven deities. They all fall because of their pride, because they get too close to the sun. They're a perfect analogy to the Babylonian king. But it's better than that, because remember how the Babylonian king tried to convince everybody that he was a god? He stuck a star next to his name, specifically Venus. And so Isaiah, being the great poet that he is, making all sorts of wonderful puns, first references a myth about falling deities, and then ties that myth to what happens when Venus when the sun rises, ties that to the way the king was pretending to be a god by putting the star in front of his name, and ties it all together to this idea that the Babylonian king is falling because of his pride, as epitomized by his insistence that he himself is a god. It's a beautiful text, it's a brilliant text, and it's about the Babylonian king from start to finish. So David, will you pass the mic over there?
Hello?
Yep, there you go.
I was wondering about the name sin, because this would be a great way for it to tie in as a bad thing. Because what is the literary root of?
As far as I know, the Akkadian and Sumerian god, and I don't actually know if Sin is his Akkadian name or his Sumerian name. I can go look that up. But either way, I don't believe it's cognate in any way with English sin. In fact, sin in Hebrew isn't cognate with English sin. Sin is just an English term, and I think that's a complete coincidence.
I actually looked it up while we were talking, and yeah, I don't think it's cognate. It certainly isn't cognate to anything having to do with sin in English, right? But there was, in the pre-Islamic period in South Arabia, so sin is in Akkad is a moon god.
Yes.
Right? And there was a moon god named Sin in South Arabia.
Almost certainly the same person. These people show up clear into Persia. These gods don't change, clear up into Persia, and then later into Zoroastrian times.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So these gods are still worshipped for a long time to come. Clear up until the Islamic Revolution wipes this stuff out. Although not completely. The Yazidis, is it Yazidi? How do you say it, David? Help me.
What?
The Yazidis,
The
Yazidis still follow a religion very similar to Zoroastrianism, related to the Persian religion, which is related to the Mesopotamian religion, etc. And they were genocidally killed a little while ago by the so-called Islamic State Daesh. So
I think also the Alawites may very well be closely related. They're the people the group that Bashar Assad is part of in Syria. They also have similar beliefs.
Okay, that I didn't. Okay, so I got to connect this to the star. The star has long been a symbol of divinity, and again we have. Let me go back. We have the Egyptian version. These are the sun deities and the apes. We've talked about the apes warming their hands at the sun. If you go back to my Egyptian lectures, we've seen this before. But these star symbols are again connected very concretely to divinity. There's our dinger, and I actually copied the passage from the dictionary, so you could look at it. You could see it in the Sumerian dictionary, the reference to this star. They've been borrowed into LDS iconography. And what's really important to me is that this was the window to the Nauvoo Temple, built by Joseph Smith in the 1840s. What's important to me about that is that this symbol, especially the five-pointed star with the point downward, has been associated with Satan, the devil, and devil worship. Again, through the same connection, Lucifer, and the connection between Lucifer and the star, and therefore the devil. And going through that exact same route that we went through Isaiah, the star has been connected to the devil. And it's very, very late. By the 1840s, there are Christians using the symbol as a symbol of divinity, clear up into the 1840s, without any thought that they'll be accused of devil worship. And it's not until the 1900s that people rail on Mormons claiming they're worshiping the devil because they put pentagrams on their temples. But I want to point that out just to show you how late that idea, the connection between the pentagram and the devil and all that is. It's very late. It has nothing to do with the ancient approaches to these texts, where the pentagram was used. It was used in alchemy and other occult-like religious contexts, but always as a symbol of divinity, God, etc. And so, unless you want to posit that Isaac Newton, because he was an alchemist, was a worshiper of the devil, you've got a problem connecting this symbol to the devil. It's a very recent innovation. Okay, so that is a long tangent, but it's a tangent, I think, that grows from Naram Sin. Naram Sin is the first person who declares, who's a king of an area next to Babylon. The Akkadians, but the Babylonians will do it after him. He's the first Mesopotamian ruler to declare himself a god, to put a star next to his name, and to make himself a god in that way. And the Babylonian king will then do it after him. Isaiah will then write polemics against the pride involved in such a behavior, and that will translate into modern myths of fallen angels and devil that have no ancient origins, no real ancient origins. All right. We probably should mention divine kingship in Israel as a small side note. The idea that the Israelite king was a god is also something that shows up in a few of the early Israelite texts. It's something that the later biblical authors, if they recognized what they were seeing, expunged, but there are passages they missed. And usually those passages then get vastly misinterpreted, especially by Christian authors who apply them to Christ, when almost certainly they actually apply to the Israelite king, where the Israelite king is claiming divinity himself, just like all the kings around him were. Some of the examples we have are, "Thy throne, O God, shall be established forever. The scepter of righteousness, changing scepter of thy dominion." I'm paraphrasing and slaughtering that passage. I believe that one's from the Psalms. And the more famous one is from Isaiah, which is fascinating because Isaiah is the one who wrote this polemic about, the pride of kings claiming they're gods. What I think you need to also know is that the term God, Elohim, in Hebrew was often just a reference to divine. The angels were Elohim. You could use it almost as an adjective to mean divine. The king was divine, but not the God of heaven and earth. And so the Israelite kings maybe looked at it a little differently. But the Israelite king was definitely connected with God. And it's immortalized by Handel's Messiah for us. Wonderful, and his punctuation messes it up. He's wonderful, counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, and what it should be is an adjective and then a descriptive, an adjective and a descriptive. It's the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the peaceful Prince. There's a pattern, there's a poetic pattern to the passage that's kind of messed up by Handel's rendition. But that passage has been applied to Christ. It's almost certainly a reference to the Israelite king and his role as a divine being who would protect his people, etc. So Nar and Sim started something that rolled on for generations. Let's go to Hammurabi. Hammurabi is another individual who will do the same thing. He'll claim his divinity, that he's a king. We have statues of the individual. He reigned over the old Babylonian Empire from 1792, and he is the person who is really responsible for ending once and for all the allegiance to the city-state. Sargon starts it, and it lasts about 3 generations. By the end of his grandson's reign, the city-states rebel, and they're back in individual hands and the individual kingship. There's an ideology there that just won't go away. Hammurabi is the individual who finally ends that feeling. From then on, everybody wants to be part of a larger alliance because they realize politically that if you're alone as a city-state, you just can't survive against the alliance of cities that are all around you. And so it becomes impractical and it just falls apart. And Hammurabi's kind of the last one to push it over the edge. And after Hammurabi, it never picks up again. Federalism wins. And the city-states' rights group lost. And he is best known for his law code, mostly because we have it. There's probably other kings who had it too. But Hammurabi had a bit of a temper. He was a grumpy guy who would often yell at people and things, but his people really seemed to like him. And granted, we have texts that are propaganda, but it lasts for generations. People will often reference back to Hammurabi. If we have a list of just people's names, people were naming their kids Hammurabi. So there seems to be some genuine appreciation for the guy among his followers. And he created this law code, which says, its purpose is to establish justice, to make sure my people are happy and that they're peaceful and there is no crime. And he claims that he cares about his people, and his people seem to believe it, given how many of them named their children after him, etc. So again, we have to compare this to the Law of Moses. There's just no way around it. If you would be willing to turn the light on up front, so I can see this, I'm going to pull out my actual copy of the Law Code of Hammurabi, and we're gonna read from it just because it's good, clean fun. The phrase "good, clean fun," by the way, was one of my religion teachers at BYU who taught Hebrew classes. He used to talk about the good, clean fun. Studying ancient languages and ancient religions is good, clean fun. And then he'd always ask us whenever I left class, because we were all Mormon, right? So we didn't drink. He'd say, "So, are you staying out of the bars?" That was his favorite question for all of us, because that was the epitome of unrighteousness, was going to the bars. But that's where I picked up the good, clean fun, and it just never disappeared. I still love that guy. He's great. Anyway, the Law Code of Hammurabi has several pieces, including blessings and cursings for obedience to the law and breaking the law. That's something we also see in the Law of Moses, obedience, blessings and cursings for keeping the law. I'm going to talk about the covenant pattern next time, where we will talk about the blessings and cursings, and we'll talk about the ritual acts that people took to enter into a covenant to keep the law, where they took upon themselves the blessing and the curse, the blessing if they obeyed, the curse if they disobeyed. So the blessing and cursing is something I'm going to point out. It's here, but we're going to talk about that in greater detail next time. The law begins with a prologue, and the prologue does, among other things, it kind of sets up why the people should follow this law. And it's mostly Hammurabi touting his horn. Okay? So we get, when lofty Anum, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, the determiner of the destinies of the lands, decided that Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, the Enlil functions over all mankind, and made him great among the Enki, and called Babylon by its exalted name, made it supreme in the world, and established for him in the midst of an enduring kingship. So that was just a lofty way of saying, when the God who is in charge of all this stuff decided that Babylon should be important and put him in charge of all the other nations, he decided that we should have law. And he put me in charge of creating that law. Therefore, this law is not from me, it's from the gods, so you should obey it. That will be the general consensus. And at the top of the tablet, we actually see a picture of Hammurabi receiving the rod and the scepter from Shamash, who is the god of the sun, but he's also specifically associated with justice. So the god of the sun and justice grants Hammurabi this law and the right to rule and reign, so that Hammurabi can establish justice for his people.
So
David?
the sun god is male?
Yes.
Weird. Because in Semitic traditions, even the languages, Shemesh, sun, or Shams, or whatever, is feminine, and the sun is feminine, and the moon is masculine.
His name is Shamash, and he's masculine.
It's Shemesh in Hebrew, it's obviously the sun,
Right.
But it's masculine, which is really interesting because, like I say, I mean, even earlier, Sin is moon god, masculine, not feminine. Masculine, as traditionally is the case in Semitic religions, but this one is contrary. Very interesting.
And you'll notice that if we went to Egypt, traditionally the earth is feminine and the sky is masculine, and the Egyptians have it backwards. So that sort of thing happened. So let's see, here we go. There's a passage here where it says he's a god among kings, acquainted with wisdom, describing Hammurabi. So this is again Hammurabi claiming divinity. When Marduk commissioned me to guide the people aright to direct the land, I established law and justice in the language of the land, thereby promoting the welfare of the people. At the time I decreed. So after, when I skipped a lot. This is where it starts. And for this long, he toots his own horn about how cool Hammurabi is. And then here, he says, after that time I decreed. So we've had two large pages of tooting horn, and then we get the law. So let's talk about the sort of stuff that's in here. If you make a false report, you'll be put to death. Thou shalt not declare false witness. In fact, it's so important that it carries the death penalty. Because we are going to potentially put other people to death based on what you say, and if you bear false witness in a court of law, you get put to. So perjury is taken seriously, perhaps more seriously than we take perjury. If a debt is outstanding against a person and a drought has inundated his field, or a flood has ravaged it through the lack of water, grain has not been produced in the field, he shall not make any return of grain to the creditor in that year. He shall be canceled of his contract or tablet, and he shall pay no interest for that year. So the law of Moses very famously forbids interest entirely. You cannot charge usury The problem is the entire economy of the modern world and the ancient world is based on interest. And the Jews failed to adhere to that law repeatedly throughout their history. It's one of the laws they just never kept. The law code of Hammurabi specifically says you can charge interest, but it sets the interest rates. Interest rates are set and fixed by the law code, and specific exceptions are made. And if your field is flooded, you don't get charged interest that year. You gotta wait till next year before you owe the interest. So in that sense, it's lenient. On the other sense, if you fail to pay back your debts with interest, you can end up a slave to pay off your debts, and your children can end up slaves to pay off your debts, etc. It's a very harsh law code in some ways, and more lenient than us in others. If a merchant lends grain at interest, he shall receive 60 kwa grain per ku of interest. If he lent money in interest, he shall receive 1/6 shekel or 1/5 shekel per shekel of silver in interest. So again, the interest rates is specifically fixed by the law code. That's interesting.
1/6, so that's 18%.
Yeah, the interest rate is relatively high, but fixed. So very quickly it moves. It begins with interest and controlling merchants and stuff, economy, and then it starts talking about adultery and marriage customs. If a wife of a person is caught while lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. If the husband of the woman wishes to spare her, then the king may in turn spare his subject. Again, we should compare this with Deuteronomy 22, etc., and the passages about adultery and the penalties for adultery in the Bible. Then there are rules for divorce. If a person wishes to divorce his wife who did not bear him children, he'll give her money to the full amount of the marriage price, and he'll make good to her dowry, and then she can go to her father's house and marry again. If she has given him children, then the divorce laws are different, etc. So there's laws governing divorce. Here's one that's fun. When a person married by a Haradolu, there are different levels of people's social status, and I'm not sure what they all are. And she give a female slave to her husband, and she has then borne children. If later that female slave has claimed equality with the mistress because she bore children, her mistress may not sell her. She may mark her with the slave mark and count her among the slaves. When a first wife bore children and a female slave bore him children, if the father during the lifetime ever says, "My children," to the children with whom the slave bore him, thus having counted them with the children of the first wife, after the father has gone to his fate, the children of the first wife and the children of the slave shall square equally the goods of the paternal estate. Why does that matter? Do we care? Probably not. First of all, slavery, it's horrible, and we can all have some moral indignation, and the way women are treated is horrific in the text, and the rights are horrific. But what's interesting to me in this passage is how it relates to the story of Abraham and his wife Hagar and Ishmael. Do you remember that story? Abraham marries Sarah, and they have no children. And they have no children, and they have no children, and eventually Sarah says, "We need a child." And by the way, I think you need to understand, it was a matter of survival. If you don't have children, no one's there to take care of you as you get old, and there's danger of starvation and all sorts of issues. You need children to inherit and to take care of you in your old age. There were no nursing homes, there was no retirement plan. Children were the retirement plan. And so what she does is less maybe disturbing when you put it back in its cultural context. And she says, "Take my slave as your second wife, because maybe she will give us a child, and we have to have a child." So Abraham takes her slave as his second wife and bears a child, Ishmael. And you'll notice the law code of Hammurabi has this, but when a man marries a Haradite and she has a female slave, and she gives the female slave to her husband. So apparently, the giving of female slaves to your husbands as second wives was a common practice. It happens in the Abraham text, specifically when she isn't having children of her own. And so the law code specifically addresses this because it was common. So what Abraham does matches the cultural context, which maybe says something about the historicity of the myths, I don't know. But what he does matches the cultural context of the way people lived back then. And you can see it in the Law Code of Hammurabi, which deals with this. And then the next part of it deals with what happens to their children and how their children inherit. Because you can imagine that there could be some contention there. I'm the child of the main wife, I'm the child of the slave. And in the Abraham story, that's exactly what happens. You remember there's contention over this. After Sarah gives her slave to Abraham as a wife, she gets pregnant late in life and has this miracle baby. And then she's worried about inheritance because now that she has her own child, she doesn't want this other child to inherit. And she makes Abraham cast them out. So that entire text is put, I think, into a very interesting cultural context by the specific laws that address what's supposed to happen when you have a female slave that's born you children and how they're supposed to inherit. And it specifically says, if you have acknowledged that person as one of your children, they're supposed to inherit like the other children. It's an interesting part of this entire thing. Okay, this is where it gets, this one's fun, I think. If a builder builds a house for a person but doesn't make the work strong, and the result is that the house collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, the builder will be put to death. Like, that one's fun. If an ox, here's one. If a person's ox was a gorer and the city council made it known to him that it was a gorer, and he did not pat its horns or tie up its ox, and that ox gores him to death, a member of the aristocracy, he shall give 1/2 mina of silver. Compare Exodus 21, 28 through 36. Is anyone familiar with that one? Do you know what it says, David? Do you remember what the law is for the ox? You're the expert on biblical law. Tell me what the applied
law. I know. No, I'm not an expert. You probably know it.
I don't.
I do, right? But yeah,
I have to look
if
it up.
the ox has gored once, and then the owner doesn't properly control it, and it gores again, the owner is executed.
So in this case, the law of Moses is harsher than the law of Hammurabi, but both of them specifically deal with the ox question. And it's fascinating that the ox question raises an entire point of intent, right, and culpability. So they had a concept of intent and culpability and negligence. Because your culpability depends on your negligence, which depends on how much you knew before you start. And it's both the law of Moses and... I was going to read the Exodus version, but David's already summarized it for me. It's good enough. But I thought it was fascinating. It cannot be a coincidence that they both use the same example. Now, these laws don't cover everything that could possibly happen. They have examples of cases that set precedents for how other cases that are similar to them should be handled. And both of them use the ox as an example to show the difference between someone who is negligent and someone who is not. And the difference is, did you know that the ox was a gorer before you? There is no way that is an accident that they would both use the same example to illustrate the larger point. There's a lot of ways you could illustrate that point. That they both chose ox goring as the way to do it indicates borrowing, beyond any doubt. Okay, now this one, I'm going to skip to the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay. Because again, we have language that implies, in my mind, direct borrowing passages. If the adopted son of a chamberlain or the adopted son of a votary found out his parentage and came to hate his foster father and his foster mother, and so has gone off to his paternal home, they shall pluck out his eye. That one's just bizarre. But we have to read it because it sets up the idea that they weren't, and by the way, there were 4 or 5 before this that were about chopping off hands for theft and stuff. So they were literally taking people's eyes as literal punishment. In the Law Code of Hammurabi, at least, it wasn't allegorical. They meant it. That's one of the ways you punish people. You can take out eyes, you can chop off hands, etc. Law was very brutal back then. And they didn't have any law against what we would call cruel and unusual punishment. If a man has destroyed the eye of a member of the aristocracy, they shall destroy his eye. If he has broken another aristocracy's person's bone, they shall break his bone. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner or broken the bone of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he has destroyed the eye of a aristocracy member's slave or broken the bone of his slave, he shall pay 1/2 his value. If, they're calling a segnor, which was a phrase from feudal, I'm trying to retranslate that as a member of the aristocracy, has knocked out a tooth of another member of the aristocracy of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. If he has knocked out a commoner's tooth, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. There's also next to it a reference to if you hit somebody and causes a miscarriage, you pay shekels of silver, but if you cause her to miscarriage and mischief follows and she dies, you'll be put to death. That law is identically found in the law of Moses, almost word for word as it's found here. But the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing is worth now discussing. Now, the rabbis implied that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and this is how it was usually applied in later Judaism, is that it meant if I knock out a tooth, the punishment is I pay you the value of the tooth in recompense, no more, no less, something of equal value. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Not physically knocking out your eyes and your tooth. The Mesopotamians were, it sounds to me, in the context of the larger passage, literally knocking out eyes and tooths. So you can assume that means that the Israelites were doing the same thing and that it's an equal recompense as a later revision, or you can apply that the rabbis are correct, and by the time the Israelites did it, it was just a poetic language that referred back to the way it was always done, but they did it differently. So I don't think I can say for sure that the Israelites did it literally just because the Mesopotamians did. What I can say is that the law code of Moses is both borrowing from this text, but it's also disagreeing with this text in very explicit ways. So this law code sets out 3 different classes of people, and the punishment is different depending on which class of person you are. When the biblical text says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it is specifically referencing this law and leaving out all the passages about paying shekels. Do you see what it left out? Right? If a member of the aristocracy hits a member of the aristocracy and makes them lose their tooth, then he will be punished by having his tooth removed. If he hits a commoner, he pays a fine. The Bible is intentionally and specifically rejecting that concept. And it's a polemic against that concept almost, by its intentional left-outedness. More so, it's explicit about it, and in several passages later, tied to that passage and connected to it, the Bible says, when you judge, you will judge righteous judgment, and you will be no respecter of persons. Thou shalt not respect persons is actually what the Old Testament says. Being no respecter of persons is how Paul says it later in the New Testament. But thou shalt not respect persons in judgment is the way the Old Testament says that. And that is a very direct reference to this. And it says, thou shalt not respect the worth of the rich and the poor differently. It actually lists them out. These classes that are in the law code of Hammurabi, the Bible lists them and then says you will treat them the same when you give judgment. So what I think is interesting about this, obviously there is religious baggage and reasons to react to claims of borrowing in the Bible. There are fundamentalists who believe the Bible is God's word, perfectly dictated, without any context, culture, or background. That is impossible. There are those who believe the Bible is all evil nonsense filled with slavery, raping, and pillaging. This is also nonsense that doesn't recognize the culture. Both of those, I think are kind of nonsensical. And then there's all sorts of interesting middle grounds. From a secular middle ground that says you can see in the Bible what Martin Luther would have called the long arm of justice in history. It's long, but it bends towards justice. The Law Code of Moses is problematic in all sorts of ways, but it's a very important step forward from the laws that came before it. It's a movement towards justice compared to what came before. The other way to see that is if you're a religious person, there are those who believe they can see God's inspiration in that slow bending and arc towards justice. Because God may not have dictated the law of Moses because there's still horrific things in it, but he might have pushed the people who wrote it and inspired them to be closer to a better way of living than the people who came before. Any of those sorts of approaches is not, I have a certain opinion myself, but my class's purpose is never to dictate a religious belief, except the impossible versions of fundamentalism. If you're an atheist, that's great. If you're a theist, that's great. But if you're a theist, you have to be a sort of theist who engages with the texts we have before us and the cultural contexts of the texts we have before us in a way that is completely different than sort of a fundamentalist approach. And that has all sorts of implications for how you deal with passages in the law that deal with everything from rape, slavery, and homosexuality, especially, which is an important one today. Because if you put that back in this sort of cultural context where the Bible is still imperfect and has horrible things in it, but it's bending towards justice, you're less likely to assume that we should treat the issues that come up in the text, like homosexuality, exactly the same way the Bible always did. And we have to do it the same way today. That's no longer something that is so obviously true. Once you put the text back in this context that I've tried to build today. So I hope that was helpful, and I will see you next month where we will talk about the rituals that surrounded law and the covenants people made to keep those laws. And I'll actually compare that to New Year's resolutions and why we're always starting our diets tomorrow. And we had a program for helping people stop smoking that I used when I was on my mission for the LDS Church. And it was fascinating because that program had elements that were very similar to some of these covenant patterns, because those covenant patterns, I think, reveal something interesting about human psychology and why we struggle so hard to keep our own resolutions and what it takes to make a commitment that changes us and that we will actually keep. And these people already understood some of that, and some of what they learned can be useful to us. So that's what we'll talk about next month, and I'll see you then. I do have I have a few minutes, depending on how long we think this class is supposed to go. But if you want, I really should take a second and give some text suggestions. So I have here at the front a list of books. I encourage you as you leave to come up and look at them. And these are the sort of books that I recommend if you're interested in this subject that you would get to learn more yourself if you want. The most important one, though, is one that I can't show you because it's a great course as a lecture. It's called Between the Rivers, The History of Ancient Mesopotamia by Alexis Q. Castor. She's a wonderful lecturer. I learned all sorts of stuff about Mesopotamia. I mean, there were things I knew before, but as I prepared for this class, I wanted a refresher. I downloaded her lectures from Audible. Great courses can be very expensive. They can charge like $200 sometimes for some of these college course lectures. But if you get them from Audible, especially if you have an Audible account, they're one credit, which is like $10. And you get a couple $100 college course on Mesopotamia, recordings of a college professor's lectures. Very good. She has a section on Hammurabi. She has a section on the sort of things we've talked about today. By far the best thing you can do, because if you just listen to it a half hour, you get a half-hour lecture to and from work every day, and in a couple weeks you've had a college course on Mesopotamia. that's the best source for this. The rest of the books are physical. I've got them up front. You're welcome to come look at them, as well as a few others that are interesting. This one is text related to the Old Testament by James Pritchard, which is where I was reading the Law Code of Hammurabi from. I also recommended this when we talked about Egypt. The Ancient Near East by William Dunstan is by far the best history of the ancient Near East. And what's best about it is it's only, a few millimeters thick. It's short, it's to the point, but it has the material you'll want to get an overview of everything. So those are the books I recommend. They'll be up front. Come take a look at them, decide if you want to come get any of these books for yourself, buy some. Again, I highly recommend the Great Courses lecture, and Pritchard is great too, if you can find a way to get a hold of Pritchard. Those will be up front. Thank you.